Welcome to everyone here and to those who are joining us online as well. I am Mara Redman with the Miller Center, Director of the Ripples of Hope project here at Miller, and I am so excited to have this conversation today and to have all of you joining us for this conversation. I think there is little question that the United States faces all sorts of challenges in a variety of different directions. And what this discussion is going to be about is how the United States can most effectively and best address major challenges facing the country. And I'm not suggesting that the folks at this table that the sum of the discussion at this table is identifying all of those major challenges, but it will be more focusing on what we have at the table are people steeped in the experience of how you solve problems and how you meet challenges from a variety of different directions, and with a variety of different types of people. And I can't imagine a better time to have some expertise on how you solve problems and how you get things done. And I'm particularly thrilled at those we have at the table joining us. I've had the good fortune to work with them in various capacities and various forms over the years, and I will say I feel very comfortable using the term unsung heroes for who they are and what they do. Because they're not, sometimes you've read about them, some of their names may sound familiar, but they are the backbone of what our country depends upon, and certainly in public service, and often in places just adjacent to public service as well. So I was very happy that they all agreed to be here. What we're going to do is kind of go around initially with an opening question to each of them. I think you'll hear similarities in the questions, but because they all come from different areas of expertise, I will say they've also all worked together at various points in various ways, some of which we were discovering in the green room. With people's familiarity with each other. But I'll give brief introductions when I ask each of them the questions as we go around, and then we'll go into a round of discussion with each other, and then welcome you all in with questions for the last 15 minutes or so, and I'll also remind folks online as well. We'll be looking to do that. So, Maggie, I'm starting with you. Maggie has worked closely with me on the Ripples of Hope project in a variety of ways, but particularly on exploring innovative efforts to mitigate maternal and infant mortality and morbidity rates. And she has extensive experience both in women's health and in legal theory and rule of law issues as well, and experience on the Hill as well as with think tanks in a variety of forms. And that's the short version. Maggie, I want to ask, you did work with an organization called Young Invincibles, love the title, in 2017 in Texas, which is also where you went to law school. And you participated there in engineering legislation that was signed into law by Governor Greg Abbott, who is still the governor there, that made 200,000 mothers in Texas eligible for postpartum depression screenings each year, and specifically provided that mothers covered by Medicaid or CHIPS could be screened when taking babies to well-check appointments. How? How did you get this done, and why did you do it?
Mara, and thank you for having me. It's wonderful to be here. So to take a step back, there's been a lot that's happened when it comes to maternal health, and certainly a lot that's happened that's changed the policy landscape down in Texas. So I went, I suppose I'm an honorary Texan. I worked for a member from Texas on the Hill on health policy, but I'm not officially a Texan. But there was, in 2017, the backdrop really is the law that Mara mentioned was the foundation for a lot of the work that I ended up doing, certainly in coalition work, to continue momentum around maternal health. This was a time when really the maternal mortality and morbidity rates were very much in the news, especially news about Texas was dominating. So there was a certain sense
and
of...
just because it was bad for the United
yes,
States, right?
Yeah,
for a high-resource
very, very
country.
Bad. There's a lot of... people talk about the rates in various ways, but the bottom line is mortality, morbidity, and mortality and morbidity rates are very, very bad. In the U.S., shockingly so when you look at us, when you compare us to our peer nations. So this was a big health policy topic. The state had made some incremental changes around postpartum depression, but one of the reasons that there was attention being paid is because the state had set up a task force. Many different states have task force on maternal health in various degrees, especially then. And so when we went down looking, and I think really my experience down in Texas, I had been up in D.C. at the Center for American Progress and moved back down to Texas to be with my husband who was working down there. And my experience moving back to Texas was just a lesson again in the fundamentals of how you move forward change, at least from my view. So there was momentum, the law Mara mentioned had passed, but there was still more to do. And the task force I mentioned was a really big part of actually shining a light on some of these issues that were coming up, and it was looking it was in danger of sunsetting. So a lot of us came together, a coalition of broad people from the medical field to child welfare advocates, and I think that's a really important part to bring a lot of different views together to really continue the drumbeat of the task force needs to be extended to continue momentum, right? And also look for opportunities to strengthen its work of looking at best practices in other states. So even though there was, I think it's fair to say, resistance in some corners of the expanding care, certainly in Texas has not expanded Medicaid, for example, but to continue the pressure points moving forward and do so in a way where a lot of different voices can come to the table. It's also as a lesson, as well as the importance of, there was broad recognition that the state, from all ideological corners, there should be something needed to be done. But there's also the challenge, as I know everyone knows, of keeping something on the agenda and of being the earworm with staff, right? You have to, there's only so many bills that can pass every session. And for those familiar with Texas legislative sessions, often they'll go into special sessions, which is actually what we had to do to eventually get this bill over the finish line. And so, we worked together. We did the letters, we did the meetings. I was invited to testify in the House, and you just kept the drumbeat going on, as well as we worked as a coalition to do whatever we could to be helpful to the staff, too, again, on that point of keeping things on the agenda and being resources and making as many arguments as possible. The time we put out, a paper on how postpartum depression specifically impacts economic security. So looking at different lenses to talk about why this problem is so critical, not only for, of course, the individual families, but the communities in the state as a whole. So, and I also would need to give a shout out. There was a woman we worked with in particular who testified, who worked with us to write op-eds. She had lost her daughter to postpartum depression, and she was a powerful voice, and was also, of course, again, the fundamentals of getting something done, lifting up the human side of this and getting in front of the lawmakers to make this compelling case that, the numbers are terrible in person, and then actually talking to those who have been impacted was a really important part. So I was honored to be a part of that effort. I was actually massively pregnant once the bill actually finally passed. So I think I just started waddling around the halls of the Texas legislature at one point of just maybe they would just feel bad if they didn't keep the bill on the agenda. But no, I mean, it was an incredible effort from a diverse group of people that I was happy to help organize and get something done. I mean, there's been a lot that's changed since then, but it was...
but not the governor.
No. It was set to be the longest serving governor in Texas. So thank you.
Thank you. Arnab, I'm going to turn to you. Arnab, among other jobs, is Managing Director of Policy Implementation at Employ America, where I added this in, not in the printed biography, but it is on his online biography, and it describes him. His work is described as translating good ideas into actionable policy. And he also has past Hill experience working with the Senate Judiciary Committee as well as with a law firm in D.C. And also has a JD, don't hold it against us, on the number of lawyers at the table, from DW. I've worked closely with Arnab on a number of issues related to mineral supply chains, which has also been under the Ripples rubric. And I'm going to quote here from, he wrote recently for Bloomberg in explaining and talking about issues related to the Trump administration investment in MP, which is a U.S. rare earths mining processing company. And about that, Arnab wrote, successful industrial policy cannot be solved with a limited toolkit. episodic appropriations, and isolated deals. Resilience and security must come from institutionalizing a comprehensive framework, one that avoids picking winners, delivers stable policy and price signals, and builds the market infrastructures needed for capital to flow to strategic sectors. Arnab, as this note, as the quote, the statement I think exemplifies, you've been involved from outside of government primarily in efforts to ensure sustainable and resilient mineral and rare earth supply chain for the United States. What would you say, and big question, are the common threads that you pull to develop and seek to implement the concepts that you do, and why do you do it?
Well, thank you so much, Mara, for having me. I don't know if I can finish with a bill passage while being pregnant. Like, I feel a little off delivering after that great story. But yeah, I think so. Employ America is an organization that's committed to macroeconomic stability. And one area of particular focus for us has been commodity market stabilization. Commodity market price volatility has some pretty outsized macroeconomic effects. So we care a lot about full employment and tight labor markets. When you see big shocks in commodity markets, particularly price swings, you tend to see inflation rise. We've seen this in the past in various episodes, and you tend to get recessions, particularly in the oil market. So we started working in this space, really worried coming out of the pandemic about a huge price shock that would put us into a recession potentially. Or on the other side, it would increase inflation so much that the Federal Reserve would then be forced to put us into a recession. And so we started really thinking about why had investment in the oil sector coming out of the pandemic not recovered, even though prices had started to rise quite dramatically. And what I think the important thing that we were able to do is identify, come to a really strong problem definition of like, why is this happening? That's like really where we start all our work. In the case of oil markets following the pandemic, shale investors were particularly parsimonious because they had been burned by price rises in the past. You've seen over the past, since the shale revolution and the U.S. became the world's major oil producers, you've seen these boom-bust cycles where companies tend to go bankrupt over time when prices turn down. And so they were just saying, like, look, we have to protect our investors, so we're not going to invest. And the result of that is even higher prices. And so we really started to try to think creatively about how you could utilize the Strategic Petroleum Reserve as essentially a floor on the market. Could you start providing some kind of incentive, some certainty in the market for shale producers so that they could go out and start investing and you could see some of the prices come down? We did some work, some advocacy on that that was successful. We encouraged the Department of Energy to change some of its contracting rules. And then we kind of started to broaden into the critical minerals space. And I think, again, we really tried to start from a place of problem definition. You see a lot in this industrial policy space, as I wrote about. There's a lot of this kind of rule by deal happening. The Trump administration is taking equity stakes in different companies. When we think about the problem for critical mineral markets, which are dominated by China, it's really a function of three things. China's had enormous, robust industrial policy for over 50 years now. They started their rare earths office in 1975. They have done an international strategy where they are, purchasing assets, mining assets, processing assets all across the world. And importantly, also something that goes under examined, they control the market infrastructure for critical minerals. So even the means by which prices are discovered are entirely dependent on the Chinese market. What that means is if you have a contract between, let's say, I'm Canadian, so I'll pick Quebec as a lithium producer. If you have a contract between a Quebec lithium producer and Tesla in Texas, they're going to have an index price in that contract. And that index price is going to be entirely dependent and on the prices in China that reflect the Chinese market. So even though China doesn't touch this market at all, the value of that contract goes up and down based on what is happening in the Chinese market. And that's an enormous vulnerability as well. And so we really started to think about resilience and competition, innovation, some of the important things that U.S. markets have done and Western markets have achieved in the past as a form of resilience. And how can we start to think about using industrial policy to incentivize better markets, more competition, more innovation, and more transparent price discovery. And so I think that's kind of how we've landed on this stuff and continue to work on it.
Great, thanks. And I know we'll have a lot of follow-up on that. Everett, I'm going to go to you next. Everett, among other things, is one of my successors as a James R. Schlesinger Distinguished Professor at the Miller Center, so I need to lead with that. And he, again, is a lawyer who is a partner in the public policy practice at Squire Patton Boggs, and he's a global trade expert. His government career spanned more than 2 decades. He served in the White House as a deputy assistant to the president for international economic affairs in President Trump's first term. Spent a lot of time as well in the House and the Senate, where again, some of us worked together, and the Office of the U.S. Trade Representative. And his service included work as the Chief International Trade Counsel to the chairman of the Senate Finance Committee. And in that context, I want to put the question to Everett. So you were serving in this role at the Senate Finance Committee in a critical time for U.S. trade policy. I think roughly that you were there 2011 to 2017, right? So one of the key challenges at that time was the reauthorization and modernization of a number of U.S. trade laws, including the Trade Promotion Authority, U.S. trade preference programs, the Trade Adjustment Assistance, and customs modernization. So a lot of Washington words, but a lot of important stuff on trade. And unfortunately, as I think what was the case then is maybe even more the case now, there was no bipartisan agreement on which programs should pass and when, which is a classic stalemate. I would say also on trade issues, there's a challenge even within parties of not having a lot of agreement on ways forward. But somehow, when you were working on this package of legislation, Congress was able to overcome the stalemate and reauthorize all 4 programs in 2015. How?
Right. Well, thank you. That was a long introduction. Sometimes I just think, oh, he's here, and let's just leave it at that. But it's really
and
great
Everett,
to be
I should
here.
also point out to people that you have to leave early, and
Yeah,
no one should take it as a
unfortunately.
personal statement on any of us.
I'm going to go help
have-
teach a class, which I'm very excited about. But it's an honor to be here with you and with these experts. And I think what we're really trying to focus in on is problem solving and how do we get things done. And in government, it's very, very difficult sometimes, and particularly when there's not there's a difference of opinion about priorities and what really matters. And in this case, to put it in context, these bills, I understand there's a lot of acronyms. Let's just say there was no agreement on what mattered. Some of the members really hated the idea of giving the president authority to negotiate trade. Some of the other members really didn't want to give worker adjustment assistance. They didn't want to give preference programs to developing nations. There was no consensus really about what the priority was. So there was a stalemate that had really lasted 3, 4, 5 years, where we would try to move a bill, it would get stuck, we'd join them together, they'd get stuck, we had stalemate after stalemate, they'd get stuck in the Senate, they'd get stuck in the House. There was different iterations, there were crises, there was failure after failure after. So getting to yes on all 4 bills in the same year at the same time was not an easy task, and it really took a lot of common attributes, and I'm going to talk about attributes. I'm not going to talk so much about process because it's so complicated. We'll never get through it all. But let's just to put it again in context, 2015 was the last time that there's been a major trade bill moved through Congress. So just think about it. It's 2025. It's been 10 years. What's happening on trade? A lot. What is Congress doing? Not much. So we've got a point where we've got a lot of change going on, and the institutions are not addressing some of that dynamism in the international economic sphere. So how do we get this done? Well, first off, we failed a lot. We tried, and we tried to advance our interests ahead of somebody else's. We tried to jam the other party. And those of you who've worked here in the Senate or the House can attest, sometimes the differences aren't between parties or between institutions. The Senate doesn't trust the House. The House doesn't trust the Senate.
The appropriators and everyone else.
The appropriators don't, nobody trusts the appropriators. But, so there's a real lack of like, well, are you really going to do what you say you're going to do? If I send you this and I give you a little bit of my authority, what are you going to do with it? In the context of the House, when you pass a revenue measure to the Senate, it opens up all revenue measures. So you don't just willy-nilly send over tax.
Because people will tack on a bunch of other stuff.
And the problem in the Senate is getting time. Once you've got a major bill on the floor, you can't go off of it unless you get unanimous consent or get cloture, and it takes a long time. So getting big things done is very, very hard. So how did we get this done? First off, I noted failure. Secondly, there was common interest. And at that point, there was an understanding this was about competition with China. There was an understanding there were things we needed to do, particularly authorizing the president to negotiate with President Obama at the time, to negotiate the Trans-Pacific Partnership. There was agreement that was a priority among enough members to get momentum and to get that common interest. Secondly, there was empathy. And I think this is so very, very important, and particularly in today's conversations, is that you may not agree, but you can at least understand the other person's perspective and why it matters to them and what they're trying to accomplish. And when you think of it in those terms, it's easier to find ways to make accommodations and to ask for things that they may not have thought about in order to kind of smooth over the differences and get that consensus. So I think empathy and understanding your, counterparty or, whom you're working with is super important. Transparency. You can't hide the ball from people and expect them to trust you. So there has to be an openness about what you're going to do. And the best way, what we did in this context is pretty interesting, because there were public statements by the president, by the majority leader, by the Speaker of the House, that if this bill passed, they would do this on this other bill. And those were public statements, transparent, to give enough trust that everybody said, okay, if I move this piece of legislation, my thing will get done too. And so I think transparency was really important. Collaboration. We ran into so many problems. There are always somebody who's going to try to stop you from doing something big. Always. There's people who identify problems and they feel that that's their job, is to make sure you don't get what you want. Because if they do that, it's like, look what I did today. So you've got to have collaboration. And finally, and I think this is super important, and it goes back to some of the discussions we had at the presidency, the conference on the presidency, you have to let the institutions do their jobs. Not every institution is equipped to do everything. And so there's certain things the House is very good at, there's certain things the Senate is very good at, and there's certain things that the White House is very good at. And you've got to give enough flexibility in the dialogue to enable those institutions to do what they do best. And in the House, it's getting things done quickly and setting the agenda and starting the process. In the Senate, it's about bipartisanship and cooperation and collaboration, because you can't get it done otherwise. So bringing those voices together and letting those institutions function is really important. And the White House has to provide the political cover and leadership. You can't make it like, okay, look, I won today, everybody else lost. It's not going to work. So to get major bills done, you've got to have those elements together. And I just think we're at a point where there's a massive transformation going on in the international economic sphere. I may be a minority believer that the Congress is going to engage and that this will eventually get sorted out. And I think when it does, we're going to see some of these elements come together to make it happen. So thank you for letting me share and provide some thought for the team.
Thanks. Appreciate it, Everett, and hoping that we'll get to questions while you're still here with us. For this particular session. Nisha, it sounded a little too dramatic. Trying to save that. I'm enough of a lawyer to listen to my sentences as I'm speaking them. Nisha, first of all, most important, I think, for this room in this setting, UVA alum. I think you're our representative. There you go, from the lawn. And Nisha is currently, since that time, is a partner at the Asia Group and has deep experience in foreign policy, international trade, economic development in public and private sectors. I'm not going to list all of her roles and positions because I don't want to eat into her 5 minutes too much. But she most recently, previous to this role at the Asia Group, served as the deputy CEO, so the number 2 at the Development Finance Corporation. And she's also worked with the U.S. Chamber on the Hill. I had the pleasure of working with her at AID, and she was at the State Department. So, Nisha, you've clearly long been involved in navigating politics and institutional divides to find areas to advance common objectives. Wondering if you can give us some color on either an issue that met those challenges in your tenure at DFC, or how you built coalition support around objectives like the U.S.-India Clean Energy Track 2 dialogue. And in whatever you choose to focus on here, I would really love you to explain the phrase that you have used that resonates with me, which is to ask, do you want to be right or do you want to be effective? Over to you.
Thank you, Mara. It's really fun to be back at UVA and to be in this room. What a great initiative, and really happy to be part of it. Look, I think that where you ended is maybe where I'll start. Do you want to be right or do you want to be effective? I think so much of our politics and so much of our approaches is about trying to capture the moral high ground and establish ourselves as being in the right. And it perhaps comes from very good intentions about conviction, about certainty, about passion. But what it also does is it squeezes the opportunity to actually build consensus, to find common ground, and to get things done. Because if you have the moral high ground, then where does the person sitting across the table from you have? If you are the right and the righteous, then what does that make them? And how do you build a compromise if you've already absorbed for yourself all of the right and righteousness? Where does the other person come in? And whether that is looking domestically at how we create effective solutions in the country or in our diplomacy, how do you approach it not from a maximalist position of what ground can you gain, but from a kind of durable win-win solutions that leave enough on the table that your counterparty feels like they got to win and not just you, because then you're building durable solutions, right? So that, and I think Rob can attest to this, that has been kind of the driving force for me, at least, in how I've approached all of my government jobs, because once you internalize that, then it doesn't matter if you're crafting solutions at DFC or you're negotiating, the Central Asia C5+1 and trying to get the Uzbeks and the Kazakhs at the same table, because you're deploying the same principles, right? And so maybe I'll start with the C5 and then I'll come to DFC. The United States didn't have any kind of a collective dialogue with the Central Asian nations. And, we had a very on again, off again, and very complicated relationship, particularly because, especially when I was working on this 15 years ago, with, challenges on democratic governance, on human rights, on many other areas, we tended to engage the Central Asians more from a perspective of why we couldn't do certain things rather than what we wanted to do. And as I engaged in my conversations as the Assistant Secretary with my counterparts in the Central Asian states, and they would, kind of raise with me, like, here we are sandwiched between Russia and China. And the United States is a partner that we really want to be able to deepen our engagement with. We have no collective dialogues within ourselves, nor do we have, a collective dialogue with the United States. Everyone's like, you can't do this, Uzbeks, human rights, how do we engage? And yet, as I went around and spoke to all of these countries, and I kind of said, okay, what are you looking for in your relationship with the United States? Fundamentally, it was economic. Everyone was really being motivated by how do we build economic resiliency and opportunity, and the United States is a partner of choice for any country around the world when they think about their economic agenda. So then, as we started talking about the C5, the outlier was Uzbekistan. Did not want to engage in that collective format. And, you know, in meeting with the then president of Uzbekistan, Karimov, I was like, you know, Mr. President, we would like the Secretary of State to come to Uzbekistan, which had never happened. And he was like, well, that would be wonderful. I said, and we believe that all of the other foreign ministers of the region should also come and be able to have this, you know, historic opportunity. And he was so enamored with the idea of being able to be first and being able to host the Secretary of State. He's like, Secretary is most welcome to come, and if the others want to tag along, you know, I will not object. And, you know, lo and behold, we were able to achieve a historic breakthrough by understanding a little bit of what the win would look like for the other side, and to be able to, you know, achieve that, right?
Which is also understanding everyone's politics, right?
Understanding the politics, understanding what they need, right? If you know what your counterpart, I won't say adversary or opponent, because it's not always an adversary, and you actually get more done if you don't look at them as the adversary or opponent. But if your counterpart, if you know what it is they need to be able to claim the ground, you know how much you have to give for yourself to be able to get what you need, then you have, you know, the openings of a durable solution. And I say durable because, you know, here we are 15 years later, and President Trump hosted the C5 just a few weeks ago at the Kennedy Center, you know, at the leader level. So these are relationships that have become now enduring over time, simply because we took the time to understand what it was that they needed out of us and not just what we needed out of them. Rob was very instrumental in the first Trump administration in thinking about DFC. And I don't want to speak for you, but I know we had conversations early on, Rob, about the fact that the United States did not have an effective tool to counter Belt and Road.
Which is the Chinese investment initiative.
And that the Chinese state capital was really financing a lot of the infrastructure development around the world, but in ways that were not necessarily not only aligned with our own interests, but aligned with the interests of the recipient countries, and yet we didn't have tools. And yet, during the Trump administration, with a combination of the efforts in Congress on a bipartisan basis by the administration and with the advocacy community, what was then kind of a, you know, anemic OPIC that was on the chopping block, I think, right, Rob? Actually was re-engineered and transformed into the Development Finance Corporation, which, with all of its imperfections, still was a much more effective tool for trying to do development financing around the world. They doubled the lending capacity, they gave it more robust tools, and it was fundamentally an act of political compromise that brought it into being, because it was the development community that was very concerned about whether or not financing tools were just going to be funding private sector for their own capital gains, or whether there was going to be a development impact, and how do you both prioritize strategic impact and development impact. And it was a series of compromise, imperfect though it was, that actually brought Democrats, Republicans, NGOs, the private sector, somewhat institutions within government that were somewhat at counter points on this, USAID, MCC, OPIC, et cetera, into actually building a really, really important institution for the United States, right? And fundamentally, it's about the compromises
Right.
that were enacted.
Right.
And that's where the right versus effective comes to play.
Thanks. And we're going to go to Rob now, try to squeeze in before Everett has to leave, but we understand Everett will need to leave a little bit more than 5 minutes from now, just to give people a heads up. Rob, as you can tell, Rob and Nisha have worked together at various points over the years. The references to appropriators were because they were both appropriation staff for majority and minority, different times over their tenure there. And so that was before Rob was at the White House, and what Nisha mentioned in terms of Development Finance Corporation. I'm willing to bet that part of their talking to each other when he was at the White House on this, they had the prior relationship from working across the table from each other.
Entirely.
On appropriations. Rob is currently a principal at West Exec Advisors. He was previously general manager of national missions and emerging technology at Microsoft. As Nisha pointed out during the Trump administration, Rob, you were in a few places here, so let me see if I've got this. You were at, I'm not going to try to do the titles, but you were at Commerce. You were at the White House as a special rep for international telecom policy and a senior advisor to the chief of staff. I'm not sure if it was in that administration or earlier, but you've been at the Office of Management and Budget as
Same
well as.
administration.
Oh, so
That's where I
a
started.
lot in
Yeah.
one
It
administration.
was.
Okay.
It was a little
OMB
dynamic. You may have noticed there's some changing around. in the
OMB,
first
Commerce,
administration.
and White House, and appropriation staff, as we talked about. So, Rob, between executive branch, Hill, private sector, you've often been at the intersection of finance and budget and national security and emerging technologies, in addition to being one of the key creators of making the DFC come into being.
Wouldn't go that far.
How would you define in this the kind of overlapping space we've talked about a major challenge for the United States and routes to resolving it based on all that you've done?
Well, first of all, it's great to see so many familiar faces from the conference on the presidency. If you were not there, I'd highly recommend, and I think in 2 years when it happens, please come. It's a great opportunity to talk about really what's going on in the United States between legislative, executive, and judicial branches, and where things might be going in the next administration, whoever's sitting in that big White House at 1600. Thanks for having me. There is, I think, a lot to be said for the people in this room. We're not talking about sexy issues today. We're talking about the hard work of getting stuff done. When you do that, you don't start with the press release. You start with a vision. You start with an objective, and you build a team, and then you go through weeks, months, sometimes years of very, very hard work and compromise to get those big things done. There's frankly no other way to really do it unless you're willing to break the relationships that really have to make Washington, D.C. work. When I came of age up on the Hill as an appropriator, yes, as untrustworthy as we were, we had to get our bills done. We had no choice. Yeah, that's what kept the government open. That's what kept the country running. That has changed with the advent of year-long CRs, which were anathema at the time when I was there. But for the defense bill, for instance, the one that I finished up with when I was on the Hill, we had literally thousands of compromises to get that thing done. We had to make them with members of Congress. We had to make them with the Senate. I was on the House side. And frankly, we had to make them sometimes internally. That culture of compromise and that culture of building relationships was the only thing that got those bills across the finish line. And one of the things I'm deeply worried about right now is that forcing function for compromise has broken down in Washington. We were fit for purpose, and now I'm concerned that that ability to get things done has lost its cachet within Washington, D.C., and that's got to be fixed. But this idea of being fit for purpose, I'm not going to focus on the legislative and executive branch dynamics. This idea of fit for purpose leads me to my big concern, and it's partially what we began to speak about earlier, is that the relationship between the federal government and industry has just broken down. We do not have a federal system that both supports manufacturing and innovation. When I was at Commerce, it's this huge building. If you get the chance to go to Washington and see the Commerce Department, it takes up literally a city block. And we used to walk around inside just to get exercise, which was fine, except it was also COVID when I was there. I'm looking down these city block long, almost 10 by 10 very statist architecture. The only thing I could imagine at the time was elevators opening at the end and then this big wall of blood coming out and two twins holding. It was a ridiculous place to be when there were only 400 or 500 people there during COVID. It's made for thousands of people to be there, but it was built for a manufacturing economy of the 1950s. It was is emblematic of the concern that I have that our federal government is not built for the innovation economy of what's driving the United States today. That has both economic and national security implications. I was in China about a year and a half ago to talk about AI. The entire Chinese government is built around supporting their industry, whether it be AI or quantum, biopharmaceuticals. Rolling stock, Made in China 2025 is a state policy to support the key technologies that China thinks will be not just driving the Chinese economy, but the global economy over the next 50 years. The United States has no such thing. Not only do we not have any such thing, we don't have a consolidated set of tools. DFC is certainly the shining star in all of this, but there is no consolidated set of tools for the government to work with the private sector and academia to be able to put together. It won't be the same way that the Chinese do it. We should never try to be China. We have a very different set of capabilities, but there needs to be a stronger set of communications between the U.S. government and industry to figure out which technologies are of strategic importance, and then to be able to move those forward in a consolidated way. I'm going to finish up in 20 seconds here. In the 1950s, Vannevar Bush articulated something called, now called the Vannevar Triangle, which is this triangle with industry, academia, and the government at the three different corners. That drove innovation. It still drives innovation today, but in the 1950s, the U.S. government provided over 70% of all research and development funding, industry relatively the rest. That dynamic has entirely reversed today. So today, industry provides roughly 70% of R&D funding, and that R&D funding goes to the top priorities for our innovation-driven economy. AI predominantly, then quantum, and then biopharmaceuticals. The government still is locked in this 1950s mentality where they think that, I thought at the time when I was running some of these budgets, that we could put money toward these things and industry would follow. It's changed. The government has to find a new way to work and leverage its authority with industry, and it can't just be writing regulations, putting tariffs on, and including export control. There has to be a new set of tools, and that's part of what I think we need to be talking about over the next year to 2 years. And I hope we can get some questions for Everett before he goes. So let me stop with that for right now.
Thanks. No, and I think a lot to follow up on with each other from that. I appreciate that. Everett, any questions you want to throw out at the table?
I have 100 questions, but I'll just make a couple observations. First, I'm really sorry I have to depart because it's a great conversation. But just picking on some of the themes, I completely agree with Robert's perspective on the ability of institutions to keep pace with the needs of the United States economy, and the governance mechanisms just aren't there. So we really need to think about that. That just goes to the point I was trying to make, is that institutions matter and how they function matters, right? And the people within those institutions have to believe in the mission, and they have to understand that they are part of something bigger than themselves and have that broader perspective in order to be effective. I'll just note that this is a very important conversation. One of the things that concerns me as a former congressional staff is that many of the individuals working in the Congress now have never done regular order bills. Yep. They have never seen an appropriations
stuff that we've all been talking about.
Yeah, they've never seen an appropriations committee meet and hammer out a compromise. They've never seen the Senate go to cloture. Yeah. I mean, this is you cannot function, our government can't function that way. So the conversations we're having, the attributes we're talking about, the disciplines required to be effective, it's a really important conversation. And hopefully it contributes to those younger professionals that are trying to carry the weight of governing now and finding it very difficult to do and not understanding some of the foundational elements needed to really be done. I'm going to steal your comment. I'm going to use it in this next class. Do you want to be right or do you want to be effective? It's really beautifully said. But I'm so sorry to leave. It's really an honor. Thank you all very much.
Thanks. Appreciate having you here with us. And thank you for doing the class as well that you're going to do.
Can I
Please.
Can I jump in on what Everett, as you're walking out the door, and Rob have been talking about in terms of our institutions, right? I feel like where we are breaking down is a bit more fundamental, and that is, what is the governing consensus that brings our population together so that institutions can function the way that they're meant to? Because if the individuals who are in those institutions don't find that there is a governing consensus that propels them, then it's really hard to be able to have the relationships, to be able to make the compromises, to be able to have the processes and the regular order, because there's not a commitment to the underlying premise of this is the governing consensus which defines us and brings us together and brings us, into these institutions. And that brings us back to kind of what you're doing here and what some of the fundamental conversations I'm starting to see happening, which is around civics. And, the U.S. Chamber, where I spent, I don't know, 6 or 7 years after the Obama administration.
Were you at the U.S. Chamber when you and Rob were talking?
I was.
When we were
When
talking
you
about
were in the
DFC?
Trump.
DFC.
Yeah.
Yeah, I guess so. Yeah. that's
Yeah.
where we were.
And, so it's about how do you instill in our society, and it has to come in really from the school on upward, that fundamental grounding in civics and what is governance, right? And what is government, and what is our obligation as citizens to that government. And it all builds up from there. I know that probably gets us beyond kind of more tactical problem solving, but
Though I have a follow-up question that, and Robbie, respond, folks should feel free to respond to Nisha, because part of what I struggle with is, I get like the benefit of civics and working that stuff, but I despair of being able to get to changing fundamentally governing incentives by spending time on process, even though I know it's been a very process conversation.
Right.
Because to me, what I found, like Maggie working in Texas, you found the right issue that was going to appeal to a bunch of people and then manage to get stuff done in a state that people might not have thought of on those things. Like, how do you see, and I think, Arnab, you've done some of this on the substance of what you're working on in energy issues. Is it a both and? Is it an either or in terms of finding the right substantive issue that will give people the experience in trying to make this mechanisms work, or do you actually have to have that underlying consensus before you start?
I mean, I think it's both. I think that, Rob mentioned a couple of sectors that have, I would say, decent bipartisan support that we need to be expanding the toolkit and engaging in different kinds of industrial policy. And it is important to, the CHIPS Act, I think, is an example of this, which had enormous bipartisan support.
Remind people of what
the CHIPS Act was passed, initially authorized in the Trump administration in the 2020 National Defense Authorization Bill, and then funded and expanded in some instances in the CHIPS and Science Act, which passed, 75 to 25, something like that, in 2022. And, it is a narrow area. Semiconductors are very, very important. The purpose of this was to expand domestic semiconductor manufacturing. And even though some of the industrial policy kind of efforts of the Biden administration have gone through, have either been cut entirely or some have been, rejiggered in some ways, that's largely stayed intact. And I think there's a lesson there that the underlying substantive bipartisan support for it helped drive that. I think there's also, to Rob's point about the toolkit, which I, fundamentally agree with, we really need to expand the toolkit. We've written about this. I'm sure you guys work directly on equity authority at the DFC and being able to make equity investments.
It's a pain point for Nisha. We talked about it.
Fixing
Scorekeeping,
scoring
right,
someday.
Yeah,
but,
which would be O&B.
a separate time. These are, I think, to Rob's point about like the fundamental relationship between industry and government. I think that it's really, I think one thing the industry writ large needs is certainty and clarity from government. And whether it's the Biden administration or the Trump administration, like the seesaw of the political, The LNG pause, something we were really critical of. Now what's happening with solar and wind, very, very, like, these are really bad signals. And, you know, we spend a lot of time on the Federal Reserve as an institution, their policies and personnel. There's a lot of things to criticize about the Federal Reserve, but they take their communications very seriously because the bond market is incredibly serious. And people treat it with that level of seriousness. And it's got some bipartisan credibility in the idea of independence. And it has a very expansive toolkit in crises where it can act, but it is guardrail in an institutional framework that lets it deploy that toolkit, but still maintain some bipartisan credibility over time. And I think that's like really important.
You look like you're reacting.
I'm in violent agreement with everything. Yeah, I was going to probably get myself into a little bit of hot water. We're discussing.
We're all agreeing too much, so you should.
We're all discussing getting things done from within the government. And I think one of the shifts that we've had over the last several years, say the last 20 years, is that some of the policy-making expertise and leverage has actually shifted outside the government. And not just to NGOs and think tanks. Granted, there's some great expertise in both of those, but industry has been taking a bigger and bigger role in policymaking, especially in some of these emerging technology areas. And
where arguably government is not terribly well equipped.
well,
right,
and
to keep
we can
pace.
talk about some of the, I think, mistakes that were made in the 1990s where some of the technological expertise was taken specifically out of the house because there's no need. As a result...
Talking about the Office of Technology Assessment.
I am, yes. As a result, Congress is often floundering to try to keep up with, what's the difference between AI and AGI, and what's the difference between a trapped ion quanta versus the Majorana particle, right? Like these are all really technical issues that very few people truly understand, but there are literally billions and billions and billions of dollars being spent by industry on pushing forward their particular thing. And they will use all of their tools to support their fiduciary responsibility for the shareholders. And those tools include leverage with government. Now, generally, I think that is done with a large amount of professionalism and transparency. But as this process moves forward, we do risk, back to Everett's point, a potential for there to be some untransparent or non-transparent policies being formulated. And that will further erode trust in government, while at the same time enriching people that perhaps, ought not be enriched. I do not think this is an imminent crisis, but I certainly think that this is something we need to be taking a look at. And Congress needs to find ways to pull back in both technical expertise and more control over spending from the executive branch, which is another conversation I think that we should be having. I'll leave it there for now. Got some
Thanks.
questions?
Questions are starting to come in, though we can still, which I appreciate and hope I'll be able but I don't want to cut us off either on the around the table. And what I might jump in with before I go to questions or as I go through them is, Rob, leading off from, you talked about Congress needs to bring in resources to itself, the kind of the expertise, and needs to start working on appropriations. Are there, to get to either of those two things, what do you think is what would be like the number one, number two actionable item that could make that happen, that could start Congress on the right trajectory towards doing those things? And I'd ask each of you to think of on whatever you see as like the major challenge you're facing right now.
So I'll say two things. One, national security is always top of mind bipartisan issue and generally pulls along other issues. So that will be, and always has been, the most important bill that they no offense to foreign affairs and the other things we worked on, but that is really, that's where the appropriations committees have focused the vast majority of their work and has the biggest support from leadership of either party to get things done. But the second one, I think, is a growing bipartisan concern about the breadth of the use of emergency powers by the executive. And that's something that started before the second Trump administration. It went back through Biden. It actually, from my knowledge, went back to at least Obama, and specific things that the executive wanted to do and could not get done using non-emergency legislative authority, so they either created or stretched that which was originally given. That is a trend which perhaps is reaching a crescendo, and I'm hearing, actually, I think we've all seen over the last week, members of both sides of the political spectrum, especially in the Senate, expressing some significant concerns about how emergency authorities are being created or are being used. To fix that, Congress will have to both draw clearer lines, get those lines passed, and at the same time, make sure that they're not overly restricting the ability of the executive to get things done in a true national emergency. And that's a tall order.
Others on that?
Did you want to go? So I'm going to take it in a slightly different direction, building on Rob's point. So for Congress to be able to exert itself vis-a-vis the executive, I think members of Congress have to be more secure and stronger in terms of how they're delivering for their constituents. One of my former members used to say, look, in Congress, you're always balancing the politics and the policy. And you want to make sure you're doing right by the politics, but you can't do anything, right by the policy, but you can't really pay attention to the policy if you're not managing your politics.
One of my bosses used to say is if you want them to be with you on the landing, you have to make sure they're with you on the takeoff.
So fundamentally, Congress has been becoming less and less empowered to be able to deliver for their constituents.
Yep.
I'm going to talk about a dirty little word called earmarks, which we all got really, happy about. Oh, we're doing away with earmarks, the bridge to nowhere.
Take one
the
quick
waste.
sentence for folks who may not know what earmarks
Earmarks were essentially provisions that members of Congress were able to attach into appropriations bills, largely that tended to deliver specific projects for their constituents. It enabled members to vote for bills that otherwise would be difficult for them to vote for, because they could justify it to their constituency. Hey, I got that post office, I got that, highway, I got funding for that hospital, or whatever it was, but specific things that they could then be able to claim credit and show value. And there was definitely abuse of earmarks, which led to this reform and this, sweeping statement of we're going to do away with earmarks. As we did away with earmarks, appropriations became less and less of a desirable role for members of Congress because it was all downside. You're voting for large spending, but you're not actually delivering. And once you start removing those mechanisms that members have to be able to really solidify their political base by showing that delivery, you make it harder and harder for them to take courageous positions, right? The power of Congress then starts to wane, and the executive leans into that vacuum, and that's where we kind of, I'm not saying it's directly, I don't want to overstate, but I'd say it's been kind of that glide path that has continually basically made it harder for members of Congress to show what they're doing for their constituents, and then they become much more wedded to these more ideological frameworks because they don't have practical things that they're able to do.
Yeah, sort of related, going in a different direction. But one thing I've been thinking about as we were discussing, I was a staffer on the House side as well after law school. And one thing when we talk about like how for staffers that are growing up right now in the moment and everything that's going on in Congress, the influence of industry. I don't know if I'm going to get myself in trouble here, and I don't want to suggest this is a particularly new issue, but it's really hard to afford to work in Congress, which means it's really hard to develop a strong set of expertise, I think, that's really important. You talk about where it goes, and it's something that would be massively unpopular. I know I'm talking about pay for congressional staff, but it's something I think we need to think about when we talk about the talent pipeline within Congress as well. And I don't mean to put down the incredibly smart, hardworking, seasoned staff that are in both chambers, but it's something I think we need to consider as we're looking at, who's going to flock in at the LA level, who are getting, incredibly powerful lobbyists who are talking to them from big law. I still remember when I started, I had a bunch of partners from one of the big law firms educating me on healthcare and being very solicitous. I was, okay, this is bizarre. But, as we think about it, I wouldn't have been able to, and I'm very lucky, but I wouldn't have been able to afford to work in Congress, and I was working for a member on the Ways Committee, so very powerful. But I wouldn't have been able to afford to do it with my law student loans unless my husband had been in big law. So I put that out there as we think about the different structural things that lead into this. That is something that I think we're going to have to keep an eye on and figure out.
A couple years ago, there was a press article or two about tech fellows that were in Congress, and I think still are in Congress. Exactly, still fully supported by the tech industry. Not usually by the companies, but by specific, very wealthy members of the tech industry. Now, again, in general, I think they recognized a need that was not being filled by the government, and they're like, we need to get informed people into these positions. And in general, I think they're using their money and their influence to get that information of those informed people and educated people in. Of course, in doing so, people with a very particular perspective were put in those positions. So one of these situations where a void was there, industry steps in to help fill it, it needs to be filled, but government needs to take a harder look at what it needs to do to fill it on behalf of all taxpayers.
So I appreciate that. Let me go to some of the questions and remind folks who are online that there's a function on the screen that I am unable to describe to you, even though someone told me what to say earlier. But you should be able to find a place on the screen to put in questions, and then they'll be delivered to us here magically. So please feel free to do that. We've got a couple questions that I'm going to combine because they get at the same kind of issue. Or related, that many here at the table have spoken about bipartisan support and cooperation as the key to solving some problems and getting stuff done. How can this type of cooperation exist in such a polarized political time? And my caveat on that will be, I worked in President Clinton's administration. We thought it was extraordinarily polarized. And the task was still to figure out how to get stuff done. I'm guessing each of the times that all of you were in government, some of that, you felt like that in different ways, maybe different or not. But I'm going to put these two questions together because to me they're related. So that and going to Everett's points, empathy, understanding, trust, cooperation. What has to happen to bring them back? I think those are related questions.
I'll put myself out as the sacrificial lamb here. Okay, so it is really, really hard to get anything done in Washington, D.C. It just is. And if one is only...
It wasn't that part of the founder's design?
Entirely. It's exactly where I was going. So it's not supposed to be easy. Making policy for such a diverse set of constituents and such a diverse set of economic situations and a diverse set of both the religious and cultural backgrounds, it's supposed to be hard. And this is my personal bias. The role of the federal government should be much smaller than the role of the state and local governments in many of these things because they're closer to the needs of their constituents. Back to earmarks. Do we really want the executive branch to be determining who gets something in Iowa where I'm from, or do we want the Iowa representative to make sure that whatever they're getting in that particular district is appropriate for what they're doing? It's I think a question we all have to answer for ourselves. I think you understand where I come down on this. Part of what I mentioned earlier about the role of outside groups is part of this hope that I have, that as this power structure evolves over time, the internal divisions within both Congress and the executive branch will be partially forced to come together by outside forces who have ingrained interests. There's a positive there. It's not entirely positive. There are concerns that I have. I'll take AI, the National AI Research Resource, which is a Biden administration AI tool that I think ended up, under NSF, maybe the National Science Foundation, was originally thought up by industry. industry, AI industry, who was concerned that access to top-level AI models and compute would not be available to academics and to government researchers. So they went in, they talked to the Biden administration and said, hey, we think you need to be doing this. The Biden administration said, okay, but we don't control the money. So they went up to the Hill and they said, hey, we think you need to be doing this. And both parties said, you're right, that makes sense. We need to be doing this. And thanks for bringing it in, because we weren't going to be able to come up with it ourselves. And had we come up with it ourselves, it would have been partisan. You're coming in, you're bringing us an idea, we both can get behind it. This is it's a leverage that has to be used carefully and has to be used with great transparency, but it is one that I think will be used more to help pull together folks until hopefully some of this fabric is rebuilt between the parties.
Maybe just like pick up on that from the outside. I think focus is really important, and you have to be focused on sometimes somewhat narrow scopes, and it's important not to buy into every single ideological position of whoever you might be allied with in the context of your advocacy, right? And I think, there are, when we work on oil and gas policy, there's people within the Democratic Party who don't like it for some reasons, there's people within the Republican Party who don't like it for other reasons. And I think we try to keep a very narrow focus on the things that we do, because that's how you build an enduring coalition. Like, I think that it is, the purpose of bipartisanship is not bipartisanship. Like, that's not necessary to making good, it's not even necessary to making good policy. As someone on the other side of the spectrum, I might have different ideas about what's good policy, but it is the key to it enduring. And I really think it's important that organizations on the outside, stakeholders inside, remain kind of focused on the task and don't let like every kind of different related or unrelated issue kind of infect the effort to get to an outcome.
So, and part of what I'm curious of, to me, that relates to when you say focus, that's you're finding a substantive issue,
Yeah.
a problem to solve. And part of what I'm curious about is how much does the work on that, building that durable coalition, then carry over to recreating the muscle memory that you're talking about, Rob, and kind of how you weave how that can be translated to other areas. Just as a quick comment on, because that's what came to mind when you were talking about it. Maggie, you've worked through a lot of very challenging, I would say, I'm going back to the question, times when working in very polarized environments, I would say. And I don't know if you think this is more than ever before, perhaps, but, does anything change in how you look at how to get the stuff done?
Yeah, I mean, honestly, I was not, you probably saw me nodding at everything you were saying, but I think it's worth repeating. Mara, you said something to me when you were queuing me up for a question of finding the right issue, and I agree, as everyone said, it was both end of those things. But I think, just to feel like I'm perhaps stating the obvious, but I think it's worth saying, in polarized, I work in healthcare. That's been, there's a lot of very polarized views for a very long time. When I was on the Hill, we repealed ACA 14 times.
I remember that.
Yeah.
I was on the floor for a lot of that.
I was always sitting behind the dais. You just wait for the vote to come and the floor speeches. But you can, for example, when I was down in Texas, I was still arguing. I feel strongly about the expansion of Medicaid. I was arguing for that while also working in partnership with a lot of folks on important policies that are also quote unquote middle of the road, but are critical to moving that forward, and being able to do both of those things at the same time. I remember when I was in the House, my boss, Representative Doggett, his Notice Act passed through on bipartisan and divided government, and both the left and the right didn't like it, so I went right on through. But it was about having to straddle those things, and even though you want to make the bigger arguments, you're not going to get there, whatever the end of that is, if there's ever an end, without doing those pieces too. And I don't, as unique as these times feel often, I don't think that fundamental truth has changed.
I'm going to try, we'll see how I do, to fit in 2 more rounds in 4 minutes.
Great.
Combine a little bit of
Lightning round?
questions. Yeah, something like that. And actually, maybe what I'll do, to be fair to you and the audience and me on time, is combine these questions. 2 combine naturally, 1 less so. One question here is, let me just read the question and then I'll give my comment before you think about it. Doesn't the current administration have a consensus to reduce the federal government regardless of any negative side effects? My comment is, I'm not sure I agree with the premise of the question, but curious on reactions. And then I'm going to put the 2 others I think are combined, and one particular I'd like you to think of as what you end on. Somebody asked about the milieu that allowed the founders to invent country, and how can current Americans reinvent the country. I actually think that's a lot of what we've been talking about, which is why I also appreciated your bringing up founders and kind of challenges we have now and part of the structure. And I would say, connected to that, what are the challenges you worry about most in terms of where we are now and what we're facing? Some we may have discussed here already, but that, I want to make sure we're serving all of the great questions we have, so take any, all, in whatever order.
Maybe I'll tackle the last one. From my perspective, and I talked about the lack of a governing consensus. I mean, I worry about a schism and a fragmenting of our society because we're increasingly consigned to our own bubbles, our own silos, and we're not challenging ourselves to be in uncomfortable places. So we're very comfortable in our echo chambers. And I think that this is present on both sides, right? I mean, you know, I had a lot of people in my kind of community, in my political community, who were shocked when I went from the Obama administration to the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. They're like, you know, they're advocating against almost everything that we fought for. How could you go there? You know, are you selling out your values? And I'm like, no, I am trying to understand the perspective of industry, because again, if you're not putting yourself in uncomfortable places and trying to understand where that other person is coming from and why and what you need to do to address their core concerns, whether you're talking about industry, whether you're talking about blue-collar workers or rural farmers or inner city, you know, immigrant workers, right? But if you're only in that, and that's where I think we're right now in danger of being, is that everyone is claiming that moral high ground of their own political constituency or community and just listening to their echo chamber. And
so
how do we
break
create
that up.
durable governing institutions in that situation?
On the first question, just quickly, I think that there are places where the federal government right now is expanding power in a lot of ways, and I don't love it, but it is happening. I am appalled and really disheartened by what's happened at USAID, but USAID was also a pretty broken institution.
Yep.
And I don't think that this kind of teardown should happen where millions of lives are potentially, lost, harmed over a period of time. But there is an opportunity for people to think about what it means to rebuild. I think DFC is an important, but it's not everything. There are functions that DFC should not be equipped to handle. Humanitarian crisis,
Disaster
a lot
relief.
of different, disaster relief, and other development, things that are purely development that don't have as much of a commercial element. And someone needs to figure out how to make USAID more, or the next institution, more oriented towards the countries it's acting in and not a handful of consultant companies in this area. And I think that's the opportunity.
So one of the issues I've been thinking a lot about recently is a different type of divide within the country. I spent 4 years with the first Trump administration, and he was brought to power, frankly, to his surprise, I think, by a lot of folks who are, this is an academic institution, so I apologize, who were really pissed off that they did not have access to the sort of economic prosperity that they saw in largely urban areas since, say, 2001, right? So even before that, say since the early 1990s, they felt left out of the prosperity of the United States. They felt ignored by Washington, D.C. They felt that their members of Congress didn't really represent them, and they frankly wanted to tear it all down. The amount of fury that I saw when I was out doing some events with the president at the time was nearly palpable. It was tough. That hasn't changed, and that's what worries me right now, is that they still feel left behind by economic prosperity. You can drive 40 miles over here toward Stanton, still see people straight piping into the creek, right? So you don't have to go very far to see real poverty. People with no internal plumbing, people who don't have access to reliable electricity. Set aside broadband. I mean, I'm talking about the basics of what we would consider to be a reasonable livelihood. The Trump administration is not right now doing very much to address that. The Biden administration did not do very much to address that. The broadband initiatives set aside. I am deeply worried that unless we begin to find ways to show for the majority of Americans, not just blue, not just red, but the majority of Americans, that government is working for them, then they're not going to want to work for government.
Yeah.
Period. And I'm not talking about being civil servants. I mean, they're not going to vote, they're not going to want to support.
Yeah.
And that will extend through the local education system, it'll extend through the local police system, it'll extend to everything that stinks of government, people will check out from. And that deeply worries me.
Maggie, anything to add to that, or?
Just nodding.
I think we're in deep agreement.
Yeah.
We're a little bit over time, so I will take this opportunity to thank all of you for joining us, to thank all of you online, and to very much thank all of you here at the table with us, and Everett, both for participating in this discussion, for what you had to say, and for all the work you have done and continue to do to meet the challenges we face. So thank you.